What's going on, everyone? Preston Stewart and Sarah Payne with War Stories, joined today by James Cosgrove. James, thanks for taking the time, man.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I'm a big fan, so I'm kind of a fanboy right now. So.
Oh, cool. I like that. Well, you dabble in a lot of stuff, and we were hoping to talk to you a little bit about that we don't really get into, not intentionally, but I kind of had grand aspirations to spend more time talking about World War I and then creep back a little further and then a little further. And we just haven't. Kind of get stuck in I don't know. I speak for myself, but I kind of like talking with Vietnam veterans. I think that's awesome. Then we start talking about modern conflicts, and I get going down those rabbit holes. So, anyways,
yeah,
you spend a lot of time talking revolution and Civil War, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, I dabble in it. Definitely, it's always been an interest ever since I was a kid, and it's a lot easier to be interested in it because I can physically go to a site and immerse yourself in that site. You know, World War II. I mean, I love all military history, but I can't just hop in the car and go to a World War II battlefield. I have to. That's a pretty big trip. I can go to a museum and learn some stories and see some cool artifacts. But my favorite thing is immersing yourself in a battlefield, and you can kind of apply it to whatever you've read or whatever documentary you've seen and things like that. So that's what helps me kind of stay interested in that time period.
that's what cued me on. Was like, I think you're one of those pages that's like, I don't know how you don't have many people watching it, because it's like you're doing like, I don't understand that, because it's Project Past and you're on TikTok and YouTube and you're like hands-on.
Yeah,
the real place, like revolutionary. And I don't know, maybe Revolutionary War stuff isn't interest as a sexy topic. I don't know. To me it is, though. Like I'm probably not big on like Civil War. I'm just kind of neutral on, I guess, for whatever reason. I don't know why.
Yeah.
But Revolutionary War, man, growing up, all of the I don't know if you want to call them myths, but the stories of that time frame, man, that was just huge inspiration for me growing up. And so to see, but I've never been to any of the sites myself, though. I've been to zero. And so to have a person who spends like their personal time, because they're so enjoyed, they get joy out of being there and exploring it and sharing it. I just think it's awesome. And it's like, well, it's well done too. It's not just, we're just doing webcams here.
It's been a huge challenge, when you first start. I mean, you guys know, as content creators, when you first start, you're like, you don't realize how much you do need. You think you just go to, like, for me, I was like, oh, let's go to a site and talk about it. Then you get there, you're like, I have no idea what I'm going to say. Like, I'm holding the camera up in front of me, and I don't want to talk in front of people, and it's been a lot. So I feel like I learned something, not only from the site itself, but from a creating aspect. I feel like I get better and better as time goes on. I'm in a position now where I can actually feel confident in my editing. Before I had an old desktop that couldn't physically handle the 4K footage. So it was really laggy, and I didn't really have a proper editing program. I was doing a lot of it on my phone. So it's been a challenge. So, just to have people reaching out that want to, talk to me about what I've seen, and it's pretty cool, because I didn't ever envision, much less my family following me, but all you guys. So it's been pretty cool. I'm learning a ton.
Something that I've never thought of, but has 100% been true for me. I wonder if it's the same there. I have learned more by creating some of this content than anything I've read or watched or whatever, because you start to go down these rabbit holes.
Yeah.
And like, if you're going to go walk Antietam, in your case, like, you got to get buttoned up on it. You can't read one book and say, I'm going to go walk this battlefield. I'm sure that you start going down all of these little trails to make sure you've got the right information, and because you don't want to sound like an idiot, and we all get stuff wrong,
and that's really easy for me.
I mean, we all get stuff wrong, but it's like this added pressure to really study it in a good way.
And there's a common misconception, like, if you're in the history, people think that you know every little intricate detail, and that's not the case, because history literally gets a day older every day. So like, even if you're interested in a certain topic, there's no way you're going to know every intricate detail down to, an individual soldier or a story. Like, so I feel like it's intimidating to a certain extent, but also it's just like, maybe if it's my goal to make you aware of a certain site, and maybe to give you like a, 10,000 foot view of Antietam, as opposed to, being, all the intricate little stories, which would take months and months to film just one battle. So that's kind of my goal. If I can make you aware of it, and maybe you can go down your own little rabbit hole, because everyone has their own interests. You can be interested in the Civil War, but you can have completely different interests than mine. I like I like the 11th New York Volunteer Infantry. Someone may like the 26th North Carolina, so they may follow the war differently, I guess. But yeah, I find if I try to take, like we're on Antietam, take that for example. That's the single bloodiest day in American history. It's a pretty important day. You take all those men, and how many stories are just in one regiment, so it's like, the more rabbit holes you go down, then you go to the site and you feel like you forget half of it because you're trying to remember it, but then when you try to remember it, you're losing certain things. So I try to maybe take a section of the battlefield and maybe learn a couple notable or important stories about that section, and then try to tell that story. I feel like in the past I've gone to battlefields and you try to tell it all, and then you forget certain facts or topics. So in Antietam, I did it a little differently. I didn't have enough time to go to the whole battlefield, so I did 2 important sections or well-known sections, and kind of just broke it down into, okay, I'm going to tell the Irish Brigade at the Bloody Lane, and then I'm going to go to Burnside's Bridge and tell the story from the Union perspective, and how the bridge was called a fatal funnel. You guys know what that is, so you have these couple 100-man regiments being funneled into a tiny bridge with the Confederates on the high ground. That's a recipe for disaster.
Oh, wow.
So that's the story I wanted to tell there. Maybe not get intimate like with the individuals of the regiments, but that section of the battlefield as a whole. So you try to like pick a certain story and try to tell it as best you can. At least that's my goal, because there's so much.
And so it is one of those things, and Preston's one who's telling me this way back when we started doing this sort of podcast thing, just about, it's sort of started just like various history topics. And I'm kind of like, well, who am I to even know anything? It's like, well, you don't have to know everything about it. And it is a part of it is a lot of people know nothing about it, who then might be interested. It sends them down their own rabbit hole also. Yeah. And I think that's what's cool, especially because again, I'm big on American Revolution, and like, talk about like never forget 9/11 and stuff. Well, I feel like never forget that we rose up against the king, and it's like rebellion is what it started as. It did not start as strict obeyance of laws. American spirit to me is like straight up questioning authority from the beginning for the most part.
Yeah, you're an ordinary person, and you're facing extraordinary odds. At the time, the British Empire was the strongest military force on the earth, and you had a bunch of militiamen and farmers, blacksmiths, people that worked in shipyards, banding together and, trying to fight this juggernaut of the British Army and Navy. So that's one of my favorite things about the American Revolution too, is that perseverance. Because it wasn't going well. We were losing almost every major engagement. How many times was Washington almost captured? He was almost killed by a British sharpshooter. Like, we were on the brink the entire war. So just to see that perseverance and, that will to really believe in a cause is pretty cool, because we try to equate that to modern day, and we don't really have, we have it pretty well. We're established. We have the strongest fighting force in the world. We have the strongest economy. We're as far as technology and our comfort of life, I think we're sitting pretty well. So there's not a whole lot as far as like a galvanizing cause. So just to learn from that and see how those ordinary men persevered is pretty cool.
But I can see how you're spending time on the Revolution and the Civil War, because what you just described applies to both pretty equally, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sarah.
It is the question of like, and it's a hard question. I think it was a lot easier 20 years ago. What does it mean to be an American and stuff? Because these stories were getting just farther away from them. You lose your Genesis stories in a way just because you get so separated from it.
Yeah.
I just went to a funeral.
We're losing veterans every day, and those stories are getting further and further away.
Totally. And think of like an 18-year-old. So it's like, I just went to a funeral for Jim Pee Wee Martin. Have you heard of that name?
Yep.
Yeah, he's in Dayton. I used to live in Dayton. He lives right by my in-laws. Guy was 101. He's a Toccoa original. Normandy, Market Garden, Bastogne, liberated a concentration camp, secured the Eagle's Nest. I mean, he did it all. and then came home and got married and built a house in 1946 with his hands. Was married for 73 years and made it to 101 years old, died on 9/11. And, but anyway, there's like, he's like one of the last. And so while for people our age, those are kind of like our grandparents' age, it's, you know, for just a young adult now coming up as a teenager, their grandpas were like Vietnam veterans. So it's just a different sort of connection to what World War II was and what it is now. The World War II people had different you know, my grandpa was born in 1919. So that means when he was a kid watching the Veterans Day parades, or yeah, there were Veterans Day parades. It would have been Civil War veterans too in those parades.
Yeah, that's crazy.
You know, so think about, and that was my grandpa. So that's not that long ago either. So history progresses, and it's like, to me as a kid growing up, it was so much of an identity, for the revolution and all those other prior things. And I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's just, I feel like the environment, those stories are getting a little bit older and
the humble beginning.
It's not as relevant, maybe. I don't know if that's the right word or not, but that's sort of how I feel about it, I guess.
Yeah. I completely get what you're saying. And you take, you know, something, you know, we have our humble beginnings, the American Revolution. We can, you know, a lot of really cool stories. But, you know, I think the coolest part being an American, we're never satisfied. We're always looking to improve, whether it's, you know, civil rights. Civil rights was a thing that was long overdue. Took till the 1960s to finally sort that out. Like that's a significant amount of time. Even women getting the right to vote. Like there's always been something along from our ancestors that they had to fight for. And I think that was part of that, kind of ingrained in that American spirit.
So something I'm interested in how you cover this stuff. When it comes to the revolution, like you're not going to hurt anybody's feelings. You can tell any story from any side, British or American. And I mean, Brits and Americans might go back and forth in a joking manner, but you're not going to get canceled by how you talk about the revolution. But the Civil War is not that way.
Super divisive.
Super divisive still.
Yes.
Just wondering how you tackle that when you go to some of these battlefields, because there are incredible stories of individual soldiers on both sides that are now Americans and might live down the street from you, or, you know, their ancestors live down the street from you. How do you tackle that?
The biggest thing, I try to look at history as objectively as possible. You know, try to keep your feelings out of it. None of us are perfect. We all have certain biases, but especially a conflict like the American Civil War, which, I mean, you can look on any social media platform. There's people refighting the war in the comment section, no matter what platform it is. It's crazy. And, you know, everyone's entitled to their opinion. So I try to just look at history from an objective standpoint. Like, hey, this is what happened. And this is, you know, I'm just telling you what happened. I'm not trying to spin it a certain way or omit something. It's difficult at times, because like I said, I'm an American. I identify as an American. My allegiance is to the United States and the Constitution. I in no way support the Confederacy or its ideologies, but like that was an important part of our history that we have to tell. Just because I don't support it, or, you know, person XYZ supports it, like, just, you got to tell the story. It's history is meant to be uncomfortable. And if it makes you uncomfortable, that just shows you like how much we've progressed from that point.
Have there been any stories that you've decided not to tell, or areas you've decided not to cover that genuinely are a part of history, but it's like, that might stir up the wrong emotion?
Yeah, it was early on. You know, military history, it's a little easier because you're just telling the events of the battle. And usually, you know, it ends there. There was, I'm trying to remember, it was the Battle of Olustee in Florida, which was the largest Civil War battle in Florida. It happened in 1864. It wasn't really, it was a Confederate victory. It didn't really, you know, wasn't significant. The Union was trying to take back Florida, bring it back into Union hands. So they were marching on Tallahassee. A small band of Confederate, mostly militia and some forces from South Carolina, met them. The regiment, 54th Massachusetts, which was an all African-American regiment, was among one of the units that fought there. And there were several other United States colored troops. That's what they were called back then. That's what their regiments were called, that fought there. Well, obviously there was, you know, the Confederate Army wasn't really a fan of fighting African-Americans, especially those that escaped slavery.
Sure.
So after the battle, there was some accounts of Confederate soldiers bayoneting wounded African-American soldiers on the field. And it was early on in this journey that I call Project Pass. So I was like, I don't want to get political. I know the nature of it. So I didn't include that part. I was just trying to tell the battle. Part of me wishes I would have, because that's, again, that I try to approach it objectively. So that's what happened. I should have told it. So that was probably the one thing I did omit, because I felt like it wasn't going to do anything but, cause people to argue in the comment section. And that's taken away from learning from the battle itself. But, it can go back and forth. Part of me wishes I would have included it because it was part of the battle. And I don't want to diminish the sacrifices of those soldiers that were bayoneted on the ground. But also part of me was like, well, maybe it's just, with the political divide right now, maybe it's not the best thing. But that's probably the best example I have.
I've done that too. Countless topics I want to get into that I know are just like, even just bringing them up are going to really start a fight. And I don't want to do that. But I went to Shiloh. We're like 2 hours from Shiloh. So I went down there.
It's on my list.
Yeah, dude, let me know. I'll meet you there.
Yeah.
That's a really cool one because it like looks very similar to how it would have during the Civil War. It's not built up. It's kind of sectioned off. So you can really kind of feel what it would have been like walking through the peach orchard, or, checking out the hornet's nest. Like, it's thick, it's nasty.
Yeah.
So it's a cool one. But if I remember correctly, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but Nathan Bedford Forrest had a big charge towards the end of that battle, or defended his guys as they were leaving, I think it was. And there's a place you go locate that on the map and say this is where that happened. And I didn't do that because I thought Nathan Bedford Forrest is probably most associated now with kind of standing up or early Ku Klux Klan. I thought, well, I've got 7 or 8 other stories I'm telling while I'm here. I just won't do that one. I didn't. And it's not, that's not a key piece of history, that little part of the end of the battle by any stretch. But, I wasn't confident enough to.
Yeah, I know exactly how you're feeling. You're like, it's part of history, but is it going to be beneficial to people learning, or is it just going to get lost into, the divide that certain people still feel about certain topics? So I completely understand.
What would you do, Sayer?
No, it's tricky. Well, no, I was just listening. Actually, I was listening to, just on the drive home, Tom Hanks interview with the armchair expert with Dak Shepard or whatever.
Yeah.
And he was talking, he kind of brought that up with the storytelling of, like, it was very progressive for him to do that movie Philadelphia, which was gay and AIDS in the early 90s, very touchy, and people didn't want to talk about that stuff either.
Yeah.
And recognize what was happening. A lot of people were putting their heads in the sand, or if they did hear stuff, they'd get angry about it. And on the one hand, they had people that were like saying you didn't do enough, right? You weren't really, because they weren't doing like love scenes, right? Where they could have easily done that in that opportunity, and sort of the storytelling and being real physical with that stuff. But he was like, that now it becomes only one side is going to want to watch that too, because it's only going to advocate for that one person's side. So whereas they're trying to get the message across to the whole, essentially, you're not trying to cover up things, but you're trying to have the broadest reach as possible to make the most impact as possible.
Yeah.
And if you ever watched the movie, they did do a very tasteful way. And I'm sure it did help set the stage for things that came later, just in our popular culture and all that. But what I'm saying is, you can easily take these events into a Confederate hate piece. Very easy to do with the bayoneting and things. You can easily shit on them all you want and make them look bad. And that's all true too.
Yeah.
Those things are true. And, but at the same time, if you're trying to tell the story as an American story, that's anybody and everybody involved. And like, I would argue the nuance is really in the context of how you present that. Cause it's like, some of the stuff is good to know, but then other parts don't really move the needle in whatever the theme or the story is. Like you were talking about Antietam. I guess I'll put you on the spot here. Like, what would you say after being there on site, doing your own research? What would you say the sort of the point of Antietam was or is? What's the lesson there? Because let's say, and especially for me, all I know it was, it's like the bloodiest day in the Civil War, and that battle was like, I don't even know the numbers. I know it was huge. But what was I feel like I get the lessons at Gettysburg You know, I understand that one, but contextually, I don't understand Antietam. And there's a lot of stories to tell. But how would you condense that? You know?
Well, the Army of Northern Virginia, they were, at the time, Maryland was a border state, very divided within the state. I think the only reason why it wasn't a Confederate state is because Union troops moved in and kind of kept it in the Union. It was, I believe it was a slave state. So in the Confederate mindset, not only were they going to take the heat off of Virginia, they were going to move into Maryland and possibly get a lot of support. I don't think they got as much support as they intended on. That's just from what I know. It could be different in certain spots, but they, of course, you know, the North had far more resources. It was untouched. You know, at the time, Virginia was already ravaged by a year and a half of war. So you can imagine what the terrain looks like in and around Richmond. That was a central focus of obviously the Confederate capital. But so once they moved in, there was an engagement at South Mountain, and then they moved to Sharpsburg. And the only reason why the Union knew about the Confederate forces moving into Maryland was Robert E. Lee's order, Special Order 191, I believe, was a Union soldier found it wrapped on around a cigar. And then, of course, you know, brought it up the chain. So then the Union Army pursued Lee, and then they would end up engaging at Antietam. And at the time, it was a critical moment for the Union because they felt like they finally had the upper hand on the brilliant Robert E. Lee, who was at that time unmatched tactically. He was outperforming the far superior numbers of the Union Army on a regular basis, him and his very capable staff. So it was one of those where I guess it was a draw because no one held the field at the end of the day. They both were pretty much where they started. But it was, I guess, a moral victory for the Union because they finally held the field battling Robert E. Lee, and they took out a huge section of his army. His army would never be the same, and those were numbers that the Confederacy couldn't replace. So I guess the point of it was to drive them out of Union-held territory. And Robert E. Lee's focus was to take the pressure off Virginia, maybe get some more recruiting numbers in Maryland, which was supposed to be kind of one of those states that was 50-50. And, you know, he ended up losing a large portion of his army. Now, they did take Harper's Ferry, which probably allowed the Union to not drive the Confederates from the field, because just as they were doing so, reinforcements from Harper's Ferry, Confederate reinforcements, kind of reinforced Lee's army, and they both held the field. But it was, you know, like we said, it was strategically a draw. They both held the field at the end of the day, but I feel like morally it was a victory for the Union, and which this moment Lincoln used as to announce the Emancipation Proclamation, which would allow not only free enslaved people in the Southern colonies, but it would allow them to join the Union Army and begin fighting for the same cause. So it kind of started shifting. You know, the war was about slavery in the beginning. More, it was about keeping the Union united more so than slavery. You know, slavery was an economic and political issue at the time, but you know, as the war progressed, it kind of evolved into that moral problem of slavery. So I think the Antietam was kind of the jumping point for that.
That's an interesting point. That this is a conversation I want to have.
Yeah.
But the whole I feel like over time we really simplify history, and one of the things we do it makes it easier to understand because this stuff's so dang complicated to everybody, even experts. It's really complicated. But the Civil War, I feel like, as I'm going through school, you're taught that the Civil War was fought to end slavery, and like I feel like if we're really particular here, that wasn't the case. The Civil War helped to end slavery. It became a point of division during the Civil War. But in my opinion, at least, to say that this war was fought over slavery kind of misrepresents that. What do you?
Yeah, I think it was more of, you know, slavery was an issue, but like I said, I think it was more of a political and economic issue. You know, the South, you know, you always hear the term like states' rights. Well, one of those states' rights is the South wanted to expand and bring their slaves where they saw fit. Sure. And the federal government wasn't allowing that. So that was one of the rights that that was a big disagreement. And then, you know, as the war progressed, you know, you had the growing abolitionist movement in the 1850s and early 1860s that finally started becoming big enough to where I feel like that became, a rallying cry for the Union. Like Lincoln saw this was an opportunity to, not only keep the Union united after the war, but free the enslaved people in the southern states. So I guess it kind of evolved from like a economic issue into like a moral issue.
And people fight wars for all sorts of different reasons, right? So to be fair, I'm sure there were people on the Union side that signed up in order to stop slavery. And I'm sure there were people on the Confederate side that signed up because they wanted to continue to have slavery. So I'm sure for some people that was the cause, just like for others, it was patriotism or a paycheck or adventure, whatever.
Yeah, it's important to acknowledge where there's Confederate soldiers in the Confederate Army that didn't own slaves and that were truly just fighting because they wanted an independent South. Absolutely. Just like I'm sure there was Northern soldiers that either owned slaves or were for slavery. It's important to recognize those things.
Good call.
Like I said, try to approach it objectively as possible. So, when the Southern states succeeded, they had secession documents, and a lot of the secession documents pointed towards slavery being a focal issue. It's in black and white. I mean, you can spin it however you want, but it's literally in black and white. So
it's a part of it. It's a big part of it.
Yeah. So it's like I said, I feel like it was more of an economic and political issue, and then as the war progressed, it kind of evolved into a moral issue. Which, as much as I love Washington as a political figure, I really want to sit down and have a talk with them. Like, hey, like what was, you had slaves, and privately you grew to become against slavery, but publicly you never spoke out about it. So I want to know why, because it kind of led up to the problems that we would have, almost 100 years later in the 1860s. It was already an issue that you had people that wanted to take advantage, not have slaves at that time of the American Revolution. And then you had some that were adamant against it and were already threatening secession just after we formed our country. So it was one of those things that was going to happen eventually. But it took the Civil War for it to end.
It's that part of it is such a part of our history, is that hypocrisy.
All men are created equal when in fact, except this group here.
It's ridiculous. But I wish I remembered his name because he'd be great to have on here. He was a history professor. He was like a teacher's assistant in college my freshman year. It was like American History 101. I was taking it. And this guy was from the South. He would show pictures of his family that were Confederates, and he was like mid to late 20s. He's got his family line, and they were like sergeants in the Confederacy. This guy personally was a Marine. He served in Iraq and stuff. I think he already had his college degree before he went in. I think he was this post 9/11 guy. And he was real personable, making jokes about being like, I'm in like Babylon right now. And I'm like, I'm looking at this wall right here that's like 3,000 years old, but it's like chipping away because, AK rounds are also flicking at it. But I'm trying to like appreciate the moment of being in Babylon too at the same time I'm getting shot at. But he explained a context to me that I just never, it's like one of those things, kind of like this hypocrisy that's always been in front of us, but you never kind of put it together. And he was just saying, hey, look, that rift from North and South started from the very beginning because the culture was totally different. The people that founded the North were Puritans, and they basically founded the North for the religious freedom to essentially invoke Sharia law. They were sort of they were known as the Taliban in a way in England. They were extreme radicals of violent radicals. I mean, they're the ones who burn witches at the stake. And in England, it's like, you're not allowed to do that. We're a nation of laws. Like, you can have religion and stuff, but you can't do that.
Stop burning people.
That's too far. So they said, screw you, we're going home, to the new world. And they packed up everybody, grandparents, everybody. They were never going back. They came to New England and they put down brick houses, and they stayed. Organic families, all of that. The South was a get rich quick scheme for anybody and everybody that can pay their way over and get gold, strike gold, strike rich, essentially, with, tobacco and things like that, or sugarcane, whatever it may be. And of course, the people that didn't have the money were the indentured servants. Who were the indentured servants? They're just poor males of the lower working class. And this was an opportunity, at extreme risk and all of that, of course, to go, and probably some adventure, I'm sure that was a part of it, but to go because they had no, in a land of lords and things like that, where everything is ranked as off a caste system of who your dad is. This was the only way out of that. And so you come over here, the point was to make your money and then go back to England. And now you can say, now I get now I've got money and now you have to call me a lord too, or whatever. Maybe you could buy land and actually be a landowner, something like that. Prove your worth, let's say. Mm-hmm. And that they never went back. They didn't go back. They ended up staying. And when they came here, the point is, it was like 20 males for every one woman. And they built shacks with dirt floors because it was all supposed to be temporary. And so they ended up staying, but just that two sort of facts, the shack with dirt floors, temporary, versus the brick buildings, and religion as sort of, you've got business as a motivator for one hand, you've got family, tradition, religion sort of on the other. Those are different concepts. You know what I mean? And that actually has nothing to do with slavery. Slavery fits into the economics, the justification for going there, of course, later. But originally it was just poor white guys doing that job, sort of dying in the fields. And just one of those things where it's like, yeah, it's right in front of my face. But then you start thinking about that context and then the timeline as things sort of progressed. And I really recommend the Dan Carlin has a quasi recent episode. It's like 5 hours on slavery. Not just American, but like probably post 1500 Renaissance slavery and to present, I guess, but mostly towards Civil War stuff. And, learning about like the cotton gin, once that was invented, I guess the South wasn't even like a top exporter of cotton. But then once that happened, we became like globally number one. It went from like don't quote me on this, but it's something like $100,000 a year in revenue before the cotton gin to like 20 years later, it's like 30 million, just something ridiculous. Yeah. And so they were just making bank on it, and it about money. But anyway, those two cultures over time, they continue to divide. And obviously it led to an eventual clash. And to me, the point of all of these stories is the lessons learned of like, to hopefully not have to go through that crap again, regardless of whatever the reason was. The fact is, Antietam, just the Civil War itself, I think that number's like 600,000 Americans died. Yeah. That's just, from battle. Who knows how many more, from disease and other things. And it just, I think some of the estimates now are closer to 1 million, but the official number, probably. Wow. But I guess the number that we have now is in the 600s. Which is insane because you think about future conflicts and they don't even come close to that number. And then in a way, I think going back to the timeline, it really is the predecessor to World War I. I mean, that's kind of the first, because even like the Napoleonic Wars that came before that, which there were a lot of those, and the War of 1812, they were pretty minuscule compared to these numbers. Yeah. And then I also think sort of that it almost paves the path towards sort of killing civilians on the battlefield and destroying civilian property, because that really wasn't a thing. Yeah, I mean, some people consider World War I the first modern war. A lot of people consider the American Civil War the first modern war. I think I lean towards more World War I being the first true modern war, but the Civil War laid the groundwork for that. You had advances in weapons. Rifled muskets were standard issue, whereas years before it was smoothbore, maybe you get something at 50 yards. Now you have a rifle that's accurate up to 300-400 yards and you're still firing 100 yards apart. You had repeating rifles. Now you had rifled artillery that makes, static fortifications obsolete. You had these giant stone fortifications protecting the coast and crucial river crossings. And, those essentially became obsolete because now the attacking force can fire far beyond what the fort can. You have Fort Pulaski, which is in Georgia, just outside of Savannah. And I believe it was in 1862. The Confederates held it, and the Union bombarded it for hours and hours. And the fort fell, and it was just in complete ruins. You have this giant, imposing structure that was rendered useless just by rifling in artillery barrels. You had, ironclad ships, cannonballs were bouncing off of them. That changed naval warfare.
What else? You had sea mines, land mines, you had repeating rifles. I mean, it's just sniper rifles. You had a group of Berdan sharpshooters. The Confederates had their own force. But, you know, they were kind of like the first Rangers. You know, they were in green uniforms. They had rubber buttons on their uniforms so they didn't make noise. And their job was to just skirmish, you know, harass the enemy. You know, so you can't, you know, that's not some American Revolution. You can pockets of British and American forces doing that. In the 7 Years' War, you had Native Americans and pockets of European forces doing that. But that was like, you know, cutting edge. You're giving them certain rifles. You're giving them certain uniforms. Like, I don't know, it just laid the groundwork. And, you know, just telegraphs, you know, you can communicate with generals in the field and not be there. You know,
Oh,
so
that's
they
a
could
big one.
fly,
Forgot about that. Yeah.
moving troops by railway. I mean, it's just goes on and on. It laid the groundwork for sure.
When it comes to the Civil War, what's the thing that you think should get more attention or kind of has you like obsessed with? You know, the thing that's not in the middle school history books, but the more you learn, you're like, oh my God, this thing.
For me, I really like learning about individual regiments because, you know, think about when, you know, call to arms and you have a regiment was formed from numerous companies. That's not something that's new, but a lot of those companies were from the same towns, same counties, you know, 2 or 3 counties make a company. So it's like those companies that form those regiments, they take on their own identity. I think that's like one of the coolest things, whether it's especially early on in the war, you had different uniforms. You know, they had like, for instance, my favorite regiment, the 11th New York Volunteer Infantry. Their contribution was minimal. They were only, I think they disbanded in 1863, I believe. But they were formed in New York City by, they were predominantly volunteer firemen from various fire companies throughout New York City. And on their uniform, of course, they had some red. They were called the Fire Zouaves, and they wore their fire company patch on their uniform. And then their regimental flag was, you know, axes and ladders and hose around it. So it's like they took great pride in not only where they came from, fighting for the Union, but they, you know, took great pride in their profession previously before becoming a soldier. I think that's, it's one of the coolest things. And you have unique regiments in the South as well that take on, you know, their identities of wherever their profession or their communities. I think that's so cool. You don't really get that nowadays.
Can you talk a little bit about because this is something I didn't know until relatively recently, and I might mess the term up here, but regular army, when it comes to the North, regular army versus Army of the United States? Because I always just grouped them all together, but they were very, very different. Or, yeah.
As far as like in the Civil War?
Yeah, because there was a very small regular army contingent.
Yeah.
Correct.
So at the time, I don't remember the exact number, but before the war broke out, it was a really small standing army. And of course, when the southern states began succeeding, you had soldiers, you know, leaving their regiments to go fight for whatever state they belonged to. So it was a really small standing army. So then when both sides began calling for volunteers, they were essentially just volunteers. You know, a lot of them signed 90-day papers, 3-month, a year. So that formed a large portion of both armies. So when you hear like the 11th New York, that it's like a volunteer infantry unit, but maybe you hear the 1st United States regulars, like that's part of the regular army. So, and obviously as the war progressed, especially the Union, they had more regular forces involved and less volunteer units, if that makes any sense. So usually when you have like the 1st New York or the 5th Ohio or, you know, any regiment that has, you know, or 14th Brooklyn, that's usually like a volunteer force that was brought into the regular army.
Kind of like federal versus state.
Kind of, yeah. So yeah, like modern day National Guard, you know, obviously they all have their unit numbers and stuff. So it's not, you know, you don't have a, you know, 1st Florida in the National Guard, but kind of similar, you know, you get federalized. And then you have your normal standing army, you know, your whatever, your regular forces or regular troops or 1st United States regulars. Usually when you see that, that's usually the regular army.
So like the 11th New York, they're fighting with guys, they stand that organization up and they're probably fighting with the majority of people that are at least from that general area.
Yeah.
But if you just go enlist in the army, in the federal army, you're going to be sent out to a unit and fight with guys from all over the place.
Yeah. So, you know, you may go wherever your basic training is, or, you know, or your camp is at that time. You may be thrown together with people from all over New York as opposed to, you know, people just from New York City. And I think that I don't know if this is like official, but I think the idea was, when you're fighting with your best friend from childhood, how much harder are you going to fight with the guy next to you as opposed to some guy that you've never met? So I think, having those, I think that's why the Civil War was so, I guess, bloody. Not only you had the technology advancing that was outpacing the tactics, but you had, people that were deeply rooted, whatever side they were on, they truly believed in what they were fighting for. And then, now your best friend's next to you that you've known from childhood. So I think that there's all those factors.
That's it. I mean, I think that we were talking about, the pro-slavery Confederate and the abolitionist Northerner fighting for these causes that more than likely both of them weren't really individually impacted from, because most people were not slave owners and most people were not abolitionists. They were just non-vote neutral, living their lives, doing their own thing. You know what I mean? Just like today, there's many problems in the world and some are engaged, but majority of people aren't, they're just sort of I don't think it was any different back then. But I think it's the sort of universality is like, well, if my neighbor's going, he's going, all these friends are going, I got to go.
I don't want to miss out on something.
It's not, I don't want to miss out, or maybe I don't even want to go, but now I feel like I have to go. Of course, there was a draft and things like that, but I think the principle of it generally is just that notion of that sort of duty and I have to do it. So it's just sort of, it's just what's going to happen. And it's just, you got to play your role in time, I guess. And I'm sure shame, it was a different time back then too, when everybody sort of had to do it. Because to think about 600,000 dying or 1 million, we were a lot smaller as a country. So, I mean, it's a big number now, but it was a huge number back then. And then to think how many people are just involved in on the individual war effort altogether over the entire campaign or whatever, the entire war itself is just, it was so impactful for our country. And then people raising kids after that, I think that's going to affect things too from that war that we're probably still reeling from. And
it was a major piece of our history that I feel like we need to focus more on, as uncomfortable as it may be. I mean, you had first fighting in cities, you had civilians being killed. Like you had pictures actually being taken. I believe the Crimean War was the first war photographed, but I think the Civil War was the first war that was widely photographed. You see the iconic images, on any Google search, and you see the casualties strewn about the fields. Like those were things that the public had no idea about until they started seeing those images and, seeing the fighting in the streets for themselves and seeing their neighbor killed or something. It was a major piece of our history that shaped us for generations.
It's interesting when you look at like paintings or drawings from the Civil War, even that show casualties. It is night and day when you see the actual photograph. How grisly some of those battlefields are. It's nasty.
Yeah, you had some of the photographs that were staged, specifically Devil's Den area in Gettysburg.
Really?
Some were staged, but they were still like eye-opening, where the common person didn't see that. Now they're opening their newspaper and possibly seeing an image from a battlefield, 400 miles away.
What do you mean by staged?
Tangible. So I forgot the photographer's name, but he would drag this certain Confederate casualty to certain spots in Devil's Den. And I'm sure the iconic image of the fallen soldier leaning up against a rock with his rifle next to him. Well, that was a staged photograph.
Okay, gotcha.
That body was moved there.
So I'm trying to parse words here, but it wasn't making the battle look worse than it was. It was just essentially getting the right picture. It's not like they were
casualty how you want.
Yeah, gotcha.
So that soldier was killed in that area, but brought to a certain point where the photograph would have been, I don't know, or real maybe. I don't know.
I'm kind of mixed on that. I mean, the point of it is to show to me, the big impact of that is they're actually showing dead soldiers in the battlefield, whether they're up against a rock or on the ground in a ditch. Like I don't. But
well, it's war journalism.
Either way,
I think the point
photojournalism, war journalism, I guess, because I'm sure they always had maybe correspondence recording battles. I would think maybe in the Revolutionary War or whatever, Napoleonic Wars.
I'm not sure.
But this is different with the newspapers type aspect. It's more traditional. Again, I think back to the whole World War I and whatever the new World War stuff we're into now is what's normal. It really starts to, in the telegraph that you were talking about, it really starts to
Lincoln
me
can
look more
communicate.
similar than different.
Yeah, I mean, Lincoln had a direct line to his army at all times. He was getting
Yeah.
updates. Like that's unheard of at that time.
So we're coming up on an hour here, but I want to make sure you get time to find out what's next. Your last video is about Antietam, last couple about Antietam. What's next in the hopper?
Well, I got a baby on the way. My wife and I have a baby on the way.
That's awesome,
so that's
man.
coming in November.
Congrats. Awesome.
So yeah, so I have a ton of content to get edited before then in anticipation for taking a little hiatus. So I actually just did a poll on my page. I have content from Manassas, Gettysburg, and a few other small American Revolution sites. And the people have spoken and they want to see Gettysburg. So that should be,
yeah, I feel like I could have guessed that.
yeah, that should be in the works. Maybe look around October-ish for that to start coming out. Probably like 9 or 10 episodes. I only spent about 2 days there. So I have to go back. I didn't film nearly as much as I wanted to, but I got about 9 or 10 episodes. And then after that will be, let's see, depending on when I want to do some civil rights stuff. I live in St. Augustine, and there is a huge civil rights history here, more than I could have anticipated, and a couple national incidents that took place. So I want to kind of spend some time on that. And then I'll have a Battle of Great Bridge, which is an American Revolution battle, really small one, really overlooked, happened early on in the war. A lot of people refer to as Virginia's Bunker Hill. The Americans were holding a section of a bridge, and they held off a far superior British force. Fort Monroe I have in the archives, and then, like I said, Manassas. So I got quite a bit.
Okay,
yeah.
I thought you were gonna say like I've got to make this one trip, in early October and get this stuff done. You've got a library you're working through.
Yeah, I got about 20 episodes banked, so it's a lot of editing. Now I do want to get out to Harper's Ferry at some point. That's number one on my list. I want to go back to Gettysburg. I want to finish Antietam, and I'd really like to go to Shiloh and maybe get. I always wanted to. Obviously, this is already being done. I know you went to West Point. You're learning from battles in the past and trying to apply it to real world. But I want to do something where go to Shiloh, and I want we'll talk about what happened there, but I want like someone that served. I want their perspective, especially you guys as officers. What would you have done differently, or would you have done the same, or how would this move affect the outcome of the battle? Like I really want to kind of tie those together and see
war game it almost.
Kind of, yeah. And just to see how something that happened in the 1860s maybe affects how we do something nowadays. I think that would be really cool.
I have one more question, then I'm going to hand it off to Sayer to kind of wrap it up here. But when you're going to all these sites, how much do you think about the time of year? Like these battlefields look very different in December and January than they do in June and July. Do you try to line it up with when the battle was fought?
So for the most part, I always go when the price is cheapest, especially airfare. But I happened to luck out. I got really cheap plane tickets, and I visited Antietam a month before it actually happened. So, the weather probably wasn't extremely different. Same thing with Gettysburg. I visited a month after the battle happened. So I try to at least get close to it. If it doesn't work out the way, I'm not completely heartbroken, but I feel like, going to Gettysburg in the winter, you're going to get a completely different view of the terrain as it would have looked in the summer, with everything lush and green. I try to.
We're here I'm in Murfreesboro, so Stones River. That was a New Year's Day battle, right? Dead of winter. Soldiers were freezing to death. It was that cold. So like when you walk those trails in May, it's like, this is not what they saw. They weren't blocked in with vegetation on three sides. The leaves were gone. The river was frozen. So, I always think about that. But
yeah, it's interesting to see. And I wouldn't mind going to Gettysburg with some snow on the ground and just seeing how the terrain is different than what they saw in the summer of 1863.
It's fair.
I think you probably see a lot more of the, elevation differences and things like that. That was one of the things about Pickett's charge. That happened on the third day of Gettysburg is, you think of a grand infantry charge, you think of an open field. Well, it's an open field, but it's not perfectly flat. So when I was walking it, you find depressions where you're completely concealed from the Union position. which is something that you don't really realize until you're walking the ground. So it's cool things like that you get to like, okay, well, this would have been a place of refuge, at least for, a minute maybe. And then now you're cresting the hill again, being silhouetted. And I don't know, it's interesting to see things like that, because that's stuff you don't get reading books or watching documentaries.
Yeah, I mean, if they've got these little mounds to run behind, I mean, now that's like bounding forward, maneuvering, more so than how I would define a charge, right? Because to your point, I picture charges just because like in military, it's I'm up, he sees me, I'm down. I'm up, he sees me, I'm down. A charge is I'm up
for a long time
and I'm up. I'm not going down unless he shoots me, I guess, because I'm up for I'm not stopping till I get to their line and crash into them, and hopefully he's down and I'm still up at the end of it, which is like totally different than cover concealment type maneuver. But I was going to say, if you're ever interested in the the Native American stuff, the frontiersmen, the pioneer stuff, Daniel Boone, Simon Kenton, like I'm in that area. Tecumseh was born in my hometown.
Oh, awesome.
And so I always grew up with those stories, Shawnees and everything, and that's War of 1812. So if you're ever interested in that and what this area is, there's plenty of stuff around here, to include also like the mound burial sites that are 1,000+ years old, which is part of still American history in a way, right?
Absolutely. There's one in Georgia, a big burial mound that I got to get to. I want to cover some Native American history. There's just so much Civil War content. That's kind of what I'm on right now. But I'm always open to anything that I can get to and turn on the camera on. So
lots of craziness all in our backyards. You know what I mean? Lots of crazy. You don't have to go to your point, you don't have to go to Europe. You don't have to fly to some random remote island in the Pacific. Like there's lots of craziness right here that is still not understood fully at the same time.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
a lot to explore.
Oh yeah.
Awesome. Well, James, thank you so much for taking the time, man. So people can find you under Project Past, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, anywhere else?
I'm on Facebook, but Facebook's kind of weird, so I don't really, it's just there. But yeah, YouTube is my main one. I'm on TikTok now. I jumped on the TikTok train.
Yeah, man.
It's been kind of cool, actually. I was kind of against it for a while, but it's kind of cool.
Interesting. People consume information there, right? You're reaching a totally different audience.
How many videos can they consume as opposed to watching a 20-minute video on YouTube? It's cool. So that's been a learning experience, breaking things down into smaller little information.
It's kind of hard sometimes, isn't it?
That shows mass. That's why I asked you. That's why I put you on the spot about Antietam, because being able to concisely state a complex topic is mastery. And that's what TikTok sort of forces you to do. And that's how we know each other, simply because of that platform.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I don't know, there's so many more details. Like I said, I try to simplify it as best I can, because, these battles are so complex. You have 100,000 men in an army. Like, how are you ever going to understand all the movements? So I try to simplify it as much as possible.
I like it. We'll put links to everything in the description here. But James, thanks again, man. And when you get to Shiloh, let me know. Meet you over there.
Oh yeah, 100%.
That'd be cool.
Thanks for having me. It's been great, and appreciate your guys' time.
Absolutely. Take care, man.